As a soulless virus spread, vulnerability and disparity bred. A nation that can lead the way, guided by head and gilded by heart. Alas, saw the divide ripped further apart. To rise above prejudice and give way to justice. To embrace every human with equity and dignity. It's time for true humanity. Our tomorrow calls out to us, invoking passion and purpose. And what each one of us does today can influence our way of living and rise as a nation of a billion thriving.
Welcome everyone. Hi, good afternoon to those who are logging in from India, and good day to those who are logging in from across time zones. Welcome to the 12th annual Dasra Philanthropy Week. Thank you so much for joining us today. And the theme for this year's forum is A Billion Thriving. And DPW marks the beginning of this movement that each one of us must make our own. If there is one action that we would like you to walk away with through our session today, as well as the dialogues across the week, it is that we urgently need to shift conversations in philanthropy to talk not only about survival, but also thriving. And how do we enable our most vulnerable to thrive? Only when each of us embraces a strong Jedi lens, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in all our work. And today, this learning lab, we will try to uncover and unpack mechanisms of innovative financing, specifically in the WASH sector, that will help us build inclusive cities. And we are very happy to have partnered with the Center for Water and Sanitation at the CEPT University to help us anchor this discussion. Of course, given that this is an online format, it has enabled us to bring in a lot more people than we would have otherwise had the chance to. So while there are a few folks that we would like to start the conversation and help us frame the discussion, there are many more people that we would want to bring into the conversation as we go along. And so it will be in an engaging dialogue format. There will be a couple of segments that we can go through, and in each part of the segment, we can try to address different aspects of the problem. And meanwhile, I would definitely encourage people to engage on the side chat window. If you have questions, you may address your questions on the side, and you can even answer questions on the side and keep the engagement on. And as and when possible, if there are specific questions that you'd want to address to any of the key speakers, then we are happy to pose them as well, depending on the flow of the session. With that, if you could, Johan, show me the slide on the key speakers today. Thank you. So we have Meera Mehta from the Center for Water and Sanitation. Thank you, Meera, for all of the insights. We have picked up a lot of the reports that has come from the CWAS's efforts over the years, and especially as also as part of your role in leading the National Fecal Sludge Septic Management Alliance. Thank you to Abha, Bharat, and Sujata as well. We've got quite a different point of view that we all, when we were doing our briefing, we had different angles in which we were all approaching this problem. So it'll be very interesting for us to unpack this as we go along. Of course, while we will look to you to lead this conversation, we also have a couple of interesting people lined up, across different stakeholders. If you, Johan, if you can show us the other experts. We have quite a few people again across borders. So we will try to bring in as many people as possible. Some of them have not been able to make it today, unfortunately, but if they attend the session later in the day, we'll try to bring them in. But broadly, this will be in a dialogue format. And with that, maybe Johan, if you can bring up the session. What we want to discuss today is, how do you really make cities inclusive, right? The rates of urbanization have gone up significantly and will probably continue to do the same. At the same time, cities are struggling to provide basic services. While all of this is happening, one of the big challenges until today was the fact that, financing itself was a challenge for cities. However, if you were to look at, both the report that, CWAS has put out via the Alliance, as well as, the India Philanthropy report that Bain launched this year, there is actually a significant amount of funding that is actually now available for the sector. So now if there is money available, then what does it take for cities to truly become inclusive, both in the design of the services, but also in the delivery as it relates to outcomes for the vulnerable populations? And secondly, how do we enable city governments to actually effectively use these funds that have been already apportioned? And again, there are different ways in which we can look at this, how much of this outlay is already available, how much of this needs to be raised. And so one of the aspects that we would also want to discuss is how do we augment this at a local level for local governments to actually completely own the agenda. So this is broadly what we are hoping to discuss. And at the end of it, we want to bring it back to the role of philanthropy in enabling these conversations to happen, these changes to happen. So with that, maybe perhaps if I can start with Meeraji, to open with your remarks on what do you see as the challenge today? What do you see are the key, levers of why we are in a position where we are today and where do we need to move towards? And then if I can request, the tech team to also show the other panelists, Abha, Bharat, and Sujata as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Arvind. As you rightly said, we are, in terms of the WASH sector, Government of India has taken a major leadership role over the last few years. And there is considerable public investments that are being made in the sector, both in terms of sanitation and more recently, even water supply is receiving increasing attention, both in urban and rural areas, though we focus more in looking at urban areas, but this is really happening across. So in this context, that where government is taking leadership is not just talking about it, but also putting the budget backing to this. 15 Finance Commission again has actually provided funding that can be used for WASH sector in a major way. So we are sitting pretty, I would say, as far as availability of funds to some extent at least is concerned. So what do we need to do? And I'm going to suggest 3 areas where we can actually work on in looking at how do we improve the context in which we are working. The first is the idea that we should be adding value to the public investments that are being made and are likely to be made over the next 5 to 10 years. So how do we do that is something that I'll try and share some ideas, and something that we are trying to do in the state of Maharashtra particularly, but through the NFSSM alliance that Arvind referred to, many of the partners working in other states are also doing. Second, Government of India and particularly Ministry of Urban Affairs, MoHUA as it is now called, has taken leadership in terms of making data available in a major way. There are all kinds of, in fact, maybe there is a surfeit of sort of data and indices that are out there now. So I'm going to suggest that we need to focus on demystifying the kind of data that is available. How do we do that? And how do we make or enable the vulnerable, and what Arvind was referring to, how do we make it more accessible to them, both to view but to also contribute to? So that's the second area that I think is necessary. And I'll talk out briefly 1 or 2 ideas that can be explored. And the third thing is, and again, government is taking leadership in this, is to look at WASH and livelihoods. And this is in a variety of ways, but 2 ways that are promising and coming up more and more is looking at SMEs. Now, SMEs is not only for WASH sector, broadly speaking, but certainly very, very relevant in the WASH sector also. And how do we contribute to that effort that is being made, as well as more participation by self-help groups in these schemes. So these are the 3 broad areas, and let me give you 1 or 2 examples in each of these. So adding value to public investments, how do we do that? Let me give you an example of sanitation-related activities that are happening in 2 cities in Maharashtra, Vai and Sinnar. They are both relatively small cities. And we have both Gates Foundation funding as well as CSR funding from HSBC to work in one of the cities. Now, using this, what we have tried to do is that you create value of the investments or enhance the value of investments already being made. How do you introduce reuse of wastewater that is being treated? How do you create the fecal sludge treatment facilities that are being created into resource centers, into picnic spots, into centers that the whole city wants to go and learn about? And so we move away from the NIMBY, not in my backyard kind of phenomenon that we often face otherwise in our cities. The second major thing is although investments are being made, it is very important that these will need to be sustained, and therefore local governments, which in Indian context play a major role, their capacity will need to be strengthened to perform this, both in a financial sense, but also in terms of technical, administrative capacities and so on. So that would be very important. And lastly, in this context, that we need to introduce the idea of using performance-linked funding mechanisms. How do we do that? Again, in the two examples that I gave, we have introduced this in some ways in these two cities for introducing a scheduled desludging service through a performance-linked mechanism. We have a private sector operating there, but using performance-linked mechanism. So how can this be done? Very importantly, that this will have to be done through government systems. And how can this be done? There are, of course, examples that World Bank uses in this program for results kind of, or the UK rate cards also use, to my understanding, a similar kind of idea. So how do we introduce these that we'll have to think about? Second, in terms of demystifying, we were trying to count. There are like maybe 10 different indices that Government of India has put out. Municipal Performance Index and Ease of Living Index. We ourselves have one called PAS, which is Performance Assessment System. Now we have a very good city finance portal, which will actually have all the municipal accounts and audited accounts on this. Now, how do we make use of these things? That is something that we'll have to think about, because there is maybe too much out there. And maybe one has to, in addition to this, there is such a survection that is going on for sanitation. Now for water, they want to introduce page-all survection. So it's too many, in my view, things out there. But maybe it is okay if we can somehow demystify and get people involved in these activities in a proper way. And how do we do that? That is something. One thing that we are exploring, and I just want to put that forward as an idea and hear what people have to say, is that for corporate sector to mobilize funding, now ESG compliance, ESG is environment, social and governance compliance, is absolutely essential. And if you really are ESG compliant, you are likely to mobilize. So can we use all this data that is out there in public domain and create something like an ESG index for local governments? And this is something, that idea that we've started to do, and we are trying to develop this in partnership with PwC. So these are ideas that we can really try and explore. One thing in terms of access for the vulnerable, and that is something that is very, very important. And how do we do that? All these various data systems that are there at local level also, city also has, how do we create support the vulnerable to have access to these better? And lastly, in terms of wash and livelihoods, I think others will talk. I see Vinit there, who has been working on this area also. But I just want to put forward an idea that we've been toying with, trying to develop a development impact bond, which brings together these ideas in a few cities in Maharashtra, about 14 cities in Maharashtra, where we actually bring in small and medium enterprises, as well as possibility of self-help groups in some cities. And how do we get them engaged in fecal sludge management, provision of fecal sludge management services in an integrated manner? And I'll stop with that. The idea there is that you will have capacity building of these entities, which is absolutely essential, but with on-the-job performance. So it's not like a training room kind of capacity building, but on the job. And how do you support them to do their job better? That is something, the idea that we have. And finally, my pet issue again, but one major issue that most SMEs and face. And frankly, when we worked with SHGs in Maharashtra, they were all hesitant to work with local governments because they said they don't pay in time. So this issue of delayed payments, what is it that we can do? And I'm hoping Vinith will have some ideas also, and maybe Manoj also. I see that we'll have ideas on this. We have one very simple idea that I'll stop with. Just as for many other services, we have very open, transparent platform where data is available. Can we introduce a platform where such data is also available in payments of contracts, both to small enterprises, big enterprises, but particularly to self-help groups? And how do we do that? And I look forward to hear from everybody on these ideas. And thank you.
No, thank you, Meeraji. I think you framed a couple of important angles, and I'm quite happy that you've already given us that there is solutions in front of us. So, the last point that you made in terms of capacity building and, hesitance to work with local governments, I wanted to bring in Bharat on that particular note. Bharat, you also try to bring in the citizen engagement angle as well as governance and strengthening governance angle. What are your perspectives on this over?
Yeah, thanks, Arvind. And yeah, I think Meera touched upon a lot of the points which I thought were really pertinent as well. So I think that was a great framing actually that she began with. From my point of view, I would look at it as, again, three things that I thought were particularly needed. The first is this question, again, which Meera touched upon of sort of building capabilities locally, right? Because I think that, while your overall framing is absolutely right that there is a lot of funding available, and that funding is actually sort of increasing fairly dramatically with the 15th Finance Commission and so on. When you actually see how that will translate to projects being implemented well locally, it's sort of hard to see how that translates to good projects being delivered on the ground, and therefore to citizens' ability to engage with the state and to actually sort of live a better life, which is ultimately what we all care about. It's hard to see that translation happening unless the ability to deliver really well on the project locally actually exists. And I think maybe to some extent, because of the federal structure, maybe the problem is sort of somewhat less in state capitals and so on, because they happen to be co-located with the state, and therefore, sort of state agencies happen to be located in the same city and so on. But I think the problem is a lot more acute when you look at smaller cities. And that's where, at least as per the 2011 census, when you look at the data, about 70% of the urban population actually lives in cities that are 1 million or less in population. And so it's these smaller cities that actually have 70% of the population. So when you think of sort of really the every last individual that's living in a city being impacted by these services, it's very hard to imagine that happening unless really small local bodies also have the capabilities to deliver effectively on these projects. And there, I think there's a couple of things. Again, Meeraji touched upon it, but sort of from our perspective, the way we've been thinking about it at Omidyar Network, I think there's a very interesting ecosystem of entrepreneurs that are looking to solve problems, whether it's in WASH or other urban related areas, that is coming up, right? And so the question of how do you encourage that ecosystem of entrepreneurs to really thrive, and make sure that they're able to effectively solve problems. And there's some of the bottlenecks that we've seen. Again, Meeraji touched upon it, things like payment issues. The government is never seen as the best customer, and therefore that impacts the ability of these startups to actually go out and seek investments from venture capitalists or other sources. So how do you address some of those issues? And I feel like that's definitely possible to do through approaches with structured financial products, right? So I don't think it's an unsolvable problem. I think we just need to figure out how to really come up with instruments that can help address those challenges. After all, if the government has expressed interest in working with a startup or in implementing a solution, it shouldn't be the hardest thing from there to help figure out how the bridge financing can actually work until the government eventually does pay up. So that feels like an easily solvable problem, but I think we just need to sort of apply minds to it and help figure that out. So that's one side, which is, how do you bring in the entrepreneurs into it? The second is also, how do you build that local government capacity itself at scale? And because again, we are talking about 4,000 urban local bodies. So doing this both through project work, as Meeraji mentioned, but also through some element of offline teaching, things like, using this National Urban Learning Platform, which Mohua has been placing a lot of emphasis on. Surely, I think there is room to experiment and come up with a lot of different approaches there. How can we, for example, take some of these innovations that, again, Meeraji spoke about that are being done in Y and Sinar and spread them really rapidly to other people, right? So that people are at the very least aware of it. So if you have a really willing and capable city official in another city, they're instantly able to pick on some of these ideas and say, oh, wow, great. If Y could do it, why can't I? And they're actually able to sort of run with that idea more quickly than I think is currently capable. I think we need to experiment with a lot of these kind of different platforms, right, which can actually help sort of build this capability a lot faster. So that's one part of it, the whole local capability building piece. The second thing is, again, you touched upon this, Arvind, in your question to me, which is this question of how do you actually bring in citizens into the governance process as well, and how do you actually engage citizens better? And for us, again, the way we think about this at ON, that's really important for a couple of different reasons. One is, if you think again of the most marginalized populations within cities, you're often not even hearing their voices because these are literally pockets of the city that are literally not on maps that are drawn, right? Because these are informal settlements that might have come up in the last couple of years, far from the time that the last census was done and so on. So these are literally unmapped pockets of the city where nobody even knows how services are currently being delivered. Right? So how do you actually get better at tapping into citizen voice? How do you get better at bringing in local community-based organizations, other civil society organizations that understand that voice a lot better than government might? So that you can really get a better picture of how services are actually being delivered on the ground, and therefore, actually sort of get that citizen voice in. Our sense is there's a role for technology platforms again there. So things like the platform that eGovernments Foundation has built. It's currently live in close to 700 ULBs, with a path to getting into about 2,000 in the next year or so, right? So it's already a platform that's there at great scale, and a platform like that is wonderful because it's already a great place for citizens to go in and put in a grievance that they might be facing, right? So I can go and complain about waste not having been picked up from outside my house and so on. But then the question is, how do you also bring the level of engagement a notch or two higher from there, so that citizens are actually active problem solvers as well, in addition to just sort of, at the very least, they should be able to complain about issues that they have. But how do you actually make them active problem solvers in the process, I think would be a deeper level to get to. And again, a lot of wonderful civil society organizations are doing work there. The question for me is actually, how do you achieve some meaningful scale on those kinds of efforts? Ideally, at least at a state level, if not nationally. And then thirdly, this question of local level budgets. Again, Meeraji mentioned the fact that things like the city finance portal is being brought up. Hopefully, that will bring a lot more transparency into what the level of budgets are. But I actually believe that a lot more needs to be done there in terms of a much deeper understanding of what the local budget even currently is, right? And in some ways, it's baffling that a lot of sort of local press does not pay attention to the local budgets in the way that they do to national or state level budgets, right? But it is the local budgets that have a lot more impact on the lives of citizens locally, and so. I think a lot can be done there, especially once the information starts to get out there. So through City Finance or other portals, you actually have the basic data available. The question then, as Meeraji was saying, is how do you actually translate that for consumption locally, so that it becomes a bit more of an active dialogue? You have a bunch of active citizens that are starting to look at that data and say, if my city is spending as much on schools as the neighboring city, how come schools there look so much better every time I travel to that neighborhood, to that village or whatever? Or to that ULB, cities there look a lot, schools look a lot better, right? So how do I get that level of dialogue happening about where the money is actually going and how it is translating to service delivery locally? I feel like that's a really important point. And in fact, CEPT University itself, Meeraji and Dinesh had shared with me this really nice budget brief that they had done locally for a couple of cities. And I thought that was wonderful in giving just a really simple but very effective understanding of what the budget currently looks like and what it's being spent on, which can then enable some of that dialogue to say, where is this money going? How much money is even being spent? Why is it not more than it currently is? I think those are all questions that need to be asked locally before we'll start to get the kind of pressure that only citizens can put on local governments, but also the kind of participation that you need to have from citizens. So yeah, those I think are some of the thoughts I had, and then I'll finally just go back briefly to this local capability building piece, Arvind, and just end with this thought of, even as we look at the problem of how do we scale, and we say, there are these 4,000 local bodies, and how do we get all of them to build their capabilities. I do think that there's some need for standardization of processes as well across these ULBs to the extent possible, so that we don't have too much of experimentation at the ULB level, and there's at least some degree of standardization. So, for example, to the examples to what Meeraji again spoke about, if Y and Sinar are doing something wonderful on the WASH front, how do we make sure that those ideas get replicated as fast as possible across as many other ULBs as possible, right? So that there's not too much of sort of testing and learning ab initio that other ULBs are also doing, right? So that you can at least get to sort of what other people have done and what they've learned from, and build from there for your local context, as opposed to starting from scratch. So yeah, I'll end with that. Those were some of the thoughts that I had.
Oh, thank you, Bharat. It was very helpful that you were building on top of everything that Meeraji said. I think going forward, I would also like to see if there are any differences that we can also bring up, because then the panel becomes a lot more interesting when there are differences as well. With that, I'll go to Sujata, and then I'll come to Abha. Sujata, Bharat started off with this whole question of converting budgets into projects and making all these as sustainable and actually workable financing mechanisms. I know you have a lot of experience in this. You have created bonds as well for local municipalities, and their ability to pay or not pay. If you can share your nuances that you have experienced in the WASH sector specifically, that will be helpful.
Thank you, Arvind. I have worked extensively with municipal corporations over the years. Despite a lot of effort, you're talking about municipal finance portal, etc. I think even large municipal corporations still struggle with their accounts. Getting audited accounts is the challenge. And those that access the bond market, SEBI requires that within 3 months, audited results every year should be available. Municipalities have got away so far by seeking exceptions, but SEBI is increasingly unwilling to give those exemptions. So there is a stage that, you're talking about things about smaller municipalities, spreading it wide. But in terms of basic quality of data, in terms of, what is available is not, audited actual numbers, is the challenge even today. The second point is what has changed over the years is that the level of dependence of ULBs and higher levels of government has gone up significantly. Whether it's the CFC transfers, SFC transfers, the abolition of octroi, introduction of GST. Suddenly, the municipal own source revenues are not more than 30 to 40% of the overall budget. So in terms of where they spend, it is completely driven either by the national agenda or by the state agenda. It's not really decided at the local level. The projects that cities take up, typically it is driven by central government schemes, be it Amrut, be it whatever, smart cities, and maybe some states also have schemes, Swachh Bharat Mission, Jal Jeevan Mission. So a lot of these are very, very grant driven and policy driven from higher levels. So very rarely is that attention being paid to what do citizens require, what is their pressing need. So that really does not happen. The other thing I'm increasingly noticing in cities is with funding coming from higher levels of government, it's a completely consultant driven agenda. Consultants prepare DPR, cities don't own the DPR, they don't know what goes into there. The consultants come and go. And the usual L1 bidding process leads to, the very low quality in terms of the consultancy provided to cities. And at the city level, there's no capacity to check whether what the consultant is providing is good enough or not good enough. So every city you'll find a whole lot of consultants, maybe 100 consultants working on different programs because of, the budgetary support available for consultancy or, program management. But the fact is there is no quality. So is there a different approach? Should we look at, states having separate municipal cadres which get trained and which are able to work, and maybe you rotate within the state? To just give an example, I mean, from my personal experience, Lucknow Municipal Corporation recently issued bonds. 2.5 years when we started working on this bond, their accounts were a nightmare. I mean, they had not, checks were just piled up, they didn't know what was lying in the bank. But you got a set of capable people, you transferred existing people out, got a few capable individuals in, and they cleaned up the system. Now, the knowledge that those people have acquired in this process of, going through the bond process is just one example. If the same set of people can be transferred to say other cities wanting to do bonds, then they impart the knowledge, the process becomes faster. But unfortunately, in the government system, they don't think that okay, this person has specialized in this, so let us use him or her for the same activity in other cities in the state. That doesn't happen. The other big gap is, I think, in most municipalities, engineers are available, other skills are not available. Going forward, you would need planners, you would need, specialized environmental engineers, you would need other skill sets, MBAs, even, company secretaries to look at compliance issues, if you look at dealing with lenders, looking at capital markets. So there is a need to build a specialized cadre to work in and at least have five, six of these, people with specializations available at a sort of central management system in their local body. So this is what will build capacity. Otherwise, consultants will come and go and reports will be provided. Nothing will happen. And that's precisely why cities are struggling to implement projects. And money is available today, you're not able to spend. So therefore, your service level benchmarks continue to be where they are. Even cities which have the financial wherewithal to plan for, delivering high quality services to citizens, there is rarely that thinking and that willingness. The attitude is always that it is top driven. Either the directive will come from government of India or the state government, and then we will comply. So very few cities have that incentive, to take that whole thing forward and say that, we have the resources, we can borrow when needed, but we will provide, the best world class amenities to citizens. So this mindset has to change and the incentives have to be right. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think this soft aspect around both skills as well as mindset shift. That was a fantastic point. Thank you, Sujata. With that, Abha, not just because of your experience in some of these bonds and other instruments, but also, how do we move towards outcomes? Because at the end of the day, we want to have these conversations lead towards inclusive cities, right? And how do we use these as, to Sujata's point, incentive mechanisms? Your thoughts, what has worked, and I think across sectors also, some of those practices that will be helpful for you to begin.
Thanks, Arvindam, and thank you to Dasra for having me. Firstly, I'm no expert in WASH. I do know a little bit about impact bonds. What's worse is they're not bonds either. So here I am, an absolute fraud in trying to get you to talk about a financial instrument that is not what it says, or a sector that I don't know. So I'll try and ask more questions and give you less answers, because there's some brilliant people who I'm sure could answer better than me. But let me help you do some framing on this, which might be helpful on what the answer is. As I heard colleagues from Meera, Bharat, Sujata say, funding exists. And the issue is that the challenges still exist as well with the funding, which is a terrible problem, right? Lots of money, lots of solutions, but impact not happening. And if I may offer, impact bonds are one tool that can help alignment of all those problems, existing solutions, existing enterprises, existing money working better. What people come to it with is let's say it's a magic money making tree for new money, but ideally my thesis is that it's better at making current money work better. And this seems like a right problem over here. It's also an ideal tool for making money that needs to take focus to the next level. So within the sector we are talking about today, if there is a universal coverage of toilets being built, how it is happening to the way the fecal sludge management is working underneath that? Are we really ensuring that the next system and the next problem is being addressed? So depending on where you start and how you decide what the problem is going to be, and I've seen many come up in the last 20 minutes or so. If you say scale is the question, you would take a different approach. If you say innovation is the challenge we're dealing with, that's a different approach. And if collaboration is the real challenge, it's a completely different approach. And I would design differently in all three instances. A funding tool is only a tool. It's not the answer. It's the tool to solve the problem you start asking the question with. And there I'd like WASH experts to tell me what is the problem where you think impact bond people like us can come in and offer some solutions. That's my first question. Let's talk about funding and how I deepen the conversation on that. Funding exists. Sujata then was brilliant. She said top-down funding, L1 bidding, and consultant-led funding usage. I'll add a couple of things. What are funds being used for? Is it CapEx or OpEx? Is it being used to do better relationships with non-state actors, get inclusion agenda in, talk to end users, or not? State is usually best at doing CapEx work. That's just the way the state works. So in education, they're better at funding this bricks and mortar, and non-profits and social enterprises are much better at looking at learning outcomes. Where do you make sure that if the brick and mortar of a toilet is built by the state, can a non-state actor come and add value in the other ends of the spectrum that you talked about? So one sort of conversation deepening on funding. Let's then talk about incentives. Each person's incentives, the carrots you use and the sticks you use to deliver your jobs are different. And some of the best nonprofits I've worked with actually are behavior change organizations. They think about the behaviors of these organizations and consider how they can change. And impact bonds are tools for that. How do I change the incentive of my L1 outcome buyer to make it more focused on outcome of making sure that it is the most inclusive safe sanitation outcome that we're doing, that the last mile receives the same service that a high-rise building is. So that's one way of thinking about incentives. The third is pricing, something we don't talk about enough. Are we paying enough for what we want to do it? So if you look at an L1 concept, government goes for cheapest way to build the largest number of toilets. In skilling, it's how many people are skilled. No one actually checks whether those young people are in jobs or staying in jobs in 3 months. Similarly, do those toilets actually work after 3 months, and to what extent are they creating more problems than they've started with? So the pricing thing becomes an important point, because if you have to uncover the right price to achieve the outcome, you need a tool to do that. And here again, my proposition is that you use a tool like an impact bond to correct pricing on this. If you want to tick all the boxes, the inclusion boxes, the end user box, long-term funding, you need to be getting the right price. If today $200 is paid, let's say per beneficiary or per toilet built, if it has to be 400 and you need evidence for that, you use a funding tool to uncover that, you mainstream the learnings into government. A tool doesn't need to exist forever. All it is a means to an end on that. And finally, I'll stop now with Arvind, the question you asked me 2 days ago, which is what can philanthropy do to all of this? Because how does philanthropy oil the machine to make this work? Philanthropy can enable all this by making sure the right questions are being answered while these things are being put together. And it can work alongside government to make them think about these solutions, perhaps even trial these solutions so that they can be mainstreamed. Philanthropy or CSR can't replace government budgets. Eventually, it's the influencing capability of these more nimble actors in financing that can have a deeper impact on the system. So that's it from me, and I'm happy to take questions and sort of readdress some of those if you like as well.
Oh, this was fantastic. Actually, you asked a lot of questions to the experts, so I do want to maybe with this call in some of the experts. Firstly, Meeraji, in case you wanted to respond to any of the questions Abha asked in terms of the bonds, where can bonds really be helpful? And then, secondly, I know we have some folks from the government also, Mr. Chetan, if you can also speak to some of this mindset shift and some of the nudges that we can enable. And, Alejandro, if you can also speak to a little bit of design, we can move to that segment. And, Meeraji, maybe if you can take first response, if you would like to, and then I'll move to perhaps, okay, afterward. Yeah, okay. So maybe if you can get the panel back again towards the end in terms of the calls to action. I think this was very helpful. I'll keep pulling you back in to answer questions. Also, please try to answer questions on the chat window. There are quite a few addressed to all of you. Mr. Chetan and Alejandro, if we can get the spotlight on them. Do we have them? Yeah. Yes, Mr. Chetan, you've been part of the government as well, right? Like, and tell us a little about the thinking that goes inside the machine.
I think I am not ready for this response, but I'll still respond because I have been part of various programs. They really want quick results. That would be one issue. I mean, this whole idea which Abha was explaining, that you spend $200 now, but you really require 400, they'll prefer to. And then you want transparent system. You want to look transparent. It's not accountable. Not necessarily you are transparent, you're accountable, but one should look on paper very transparent and accountable. That is second thing. And more as we go through all this increasing accountability and transparency goes up, more and more people are getting scared of doing something which is innovative but risky. I mean, that is something, and that is where the role of philanthropy, CSR funds should come in. Even impact funds should bring in that innovations in the process and long-term sustainability. I think I would do so. Somehow, I don't know, I got an impression that you wanted me to talk about Kerala. So Should I say something now, or you want to keep it for later thing? Okay.
No, please.
Kerala water and sanitation financing should be first seen as overall governance in Kerala. Kerala has very high level of decentralization in our urban governance. I think we need to realize they have executive mayors and presidents of the panchayat.
Hello, Mr. Chetan, I think we have lost your audio. Okay, so I'll request the team to maybe check with him. Meanwhile, maybe Alejandro, we can start off with your views as well on design and delivery. And if he comes back after your contribution, then we can bring him back.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me? Just checking. Yes, thank you. So yeah, it's very interesting points made so far, and yeah, from a let's say, less experience in India and all of you, and coming from let's say more of a global perspective, there are some things I would like to raise. Some points. Coming to the question that was just raised by Abba. For me, an important aspect of what we need to improve is collaboration, right? Among the three that you were mentioning, because one other thing that seems to be coming through these conversations as well is not necessarily a high degree of trust between the different stakeholders and the possibility to really engage the communities and engage into inclusive participatory processes. And I think Sujata was really making the point about that, to what extent are we really making, even if the funds are there, to what extent are the projects really serving the purpose, even if we make those projects be happening. And that speaks as well to this behavior change, of course, that was mentioned, changing the attitudes towards engagement with the population, between the local governments and the citizens, right? And how to make them part of those let's say projects design, right? And then I think we have to work on those, let's say, local level participatory processes to be able to then engage the citizens in what is happening, as well as then being aware and then being able to use the wide range of information and portals and tools that are available. But then, as Chetan just said, I mean, one thing is having information and being transparent. Accountability is another step beyond that. Transparency helps us to build on accountability, but it's not automatic. You need then to have the engagement of the cities, you need to have the capacity to ask for it, and then you need to have a culture of responsiveness. So to be then responding to these requests, to the claims, to okay, what are we doing? To explain and justify what are the decisions taken. And that is not only putting information out there in the public. So we have to also work on that, on those elements, and that has also a dimension of inclusion and participation, so that this accountability is also part of the culture that needs to be created. Another important thing I would like to raise that has not been perhaps openly mentioned so far is there is financing. We are, as I hear, struggling to translate this financing into meaningful projects. At the same time, an overflow of finance is also a risk if you don't have the adequate mechanisms and control measures. So that is something where we shouldn't forget aspects related to potential avenues for corruption and misuse of of funds, right? Which speak to, of course, having information available, but then engaging the citizens and building on accountability processes. Yeah, and finally, in this round, I would like to hear your comments as well related to sustainability of the investments done, and how can we also put that into the financing mechanism, because it was just said, I think, by Abba, by Chitan, okay, first in investment to extend coverage in a quick way on top of that, but then how do we keep that alive, and how do we make the finance for that? Because that is typically a big problem, even if in the percentage is not high. If compared to the initial investment, it has to be recurrent, and then how do we put that into a long-term financing strategy? Thank you very much for this, and then over to you for this.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alvaro. In fact, if I can request the team to pull up the poll, having heard a couple of perspectives so far, if the participants can maybe chip in, if the tech team can launch the poll, please. Okay, good. I think the consensus seems to be emerging on what are two priority areas. Maybe with that, there is clearly something around the capacity and engagement of citizens. Maybe with this, I wanted to bring in, if RK, if you are there, USAID is also providing a lot of this kind of support. At least has started some of this in the WASH sector. And Manoj, if you are there, if you can also speak to a little bit around these two questions, right? Like, how do we bring those expertise within these within the local governments, but also then engaging with the citizens. Manoj, perhaps we can start off with you, and then if RK is there, I would like to bring in RK after that.
Yeah, thanks, Arvind. This is indeed, I'm glad the poll came through. It really helps me in what I thought would be pertinent to this conversation. What's very interesting, and for those who are still not familiar with water.org's mission, and where we are trying to capitalize more of the funds and mobilize funds for bringing in, for taking an alternative way to water and sanitation, solving that problem. So we started this journey of alternative financing for WASH using various financial institutions in 2008, if you can imagine. And over a period of 13 years, we have done through our partners, have done over 3.1 million loans. They've impacted over 14 million people. That's over a crore people who took a loan in their lives, solved their own water and sanitation issues, and moved on. So India has, at an individual level, has come through a major journey of what it is, where people have started to evolve and understand the benefits and the importance of alternative financing for WASH. So our basic, if I look back over the 13 years that we've been working, what has really been happening? So I look at it as a financial triangulation approach that we have taken. The first approach was to create the pipe. The pipe was basically getting various financial institutions to start understanding that water sanitation is a product that it's a financial product, and it is a very viable product. Building that pipe started with working with small NBFCs, MFIs, and then now over the period of time, large commercial banks have gotten involved into it. rural RRBs, rural regional banks have got into it. Public banks now have a product. IDBI has a product. Bank of Baroda has a product. PNB has a wash product. So this whole creation of pipe was the first, I think, what has happened. And why it's important, if it has been created at the individual household wash needs, it is easier now to take it to the MSME needs and think of it as what has already happened through it. We earlier talked about innovate, but also use what is available. The second part of the triangulation, financial triangulation, was allow more funds to flow through it. Because the problem is, even if you create that pipe, if not enough funds are flowing through it, you're still having a bad pipe at the end of the day. So we started in 2015 by bringing the priority sector lending, water and sanitation as part of the social sector came into it. That gave some impetus to growth. We then working with, we have water equity, which is, if you see, Banka Bayalu got funded by it. And so we started to find ways by which it is. And the next step is where Meeraji was talking about, is to create, social impact bonds and DIBs, and then use those to create further funding. And then the latest, which happened recently in October, was NABARD giving a refinancing program. So all this is actually helping the pipe to get more and more full. And I'm hoping that in years to come, more funds will flow through the system. The third side of the triangulation, if you have to get it right, is the awareness and the capacity development. Both these things take very long, but the capacity development of the loan officer is so weak at this stage. Even after 5-6 years of priority sector lending, if you go to an average branch in the country and you say, I've got a wash project, and they will say, well, we are not ready for it. This is not, and whereas we've been saying it is an income generating loan. If you have clean water and sanitation, you will end up having very good health, and therefore better productive days. All this is connected. And awareness is also low. So capacity development awareness is something which is lacking. UNICEF did a study and found that only 19% of the people are aware that there is a water and sanitation product at the SHG level. Financial institutions don't have it. So what we need to do is we need to take a holistic view and attack it from all three angles. The more you do it for individual and complementary to we do it with for the MSME segment. I want to take that into how do we work, and one of the very interesting issues that came up earlier in this conversation was how do we work with the government and how do we align to it? And I think the government has to take a position of more complementarian approach to it. When we started SBM and the ODF was achieved, from what I've heard, 80% of the single pit toilets that were made in Odisha need retrofitting. They were single pit toilets. They needed to be converted into twin pits. Now that the government is not putting funds into, and therefore the mechanism has to be complementarian, that private financial institutions can help solve those issues. The government has done its part. And the same would happen in JJM, the same would happen in other cases. So my recommendation are the three things that are today blocking it are, one, for instance, more CSR funds need to come into play. Now, you would say, well, how do you expect the CSR? Actually, more innovative approach has to come in. If you look at it recently on in January, on April 1st, the revised CSR law is coming in. And what does it say? That it effectively chokes innovation. It says, I want you to report back the impact you have created. When we went to the government and said, hey, impact bonds, and somebody should take the risk on the impact bond, or somebody should take make it on performance-based linkages and pay for the impact, their response was, India is not, CSR is not mature enough to do it. And we were like, give it the top 100 CSR companies to do that, so that at least the innovation approach has started in the CSR program. Second, concepts like, and that really the CSR, Abba, you talked about, it's not enough. The philanthropy and the CSR is not enough for government. And I say the philanthropy and the CSR actually should catalyze the government funding to get better outcomes out of it. That's my thought onto it. Blended financing, again, the government looks at it many times as my project versus our project. The minute you switch to a blended financing model and you have bridge funding concepts, you've really solved the issue in a collective way. Not everything needs to be done by the government. And we fall into that trap in SBM, we fall into a JJM. So, and that's not sustainable in the long run. And my last comment was on the, we look at many times innovation as SIB, DIB, and all the great, how we are going to bring in the funds. Sometimes innovation is very simple in its nature. Establishing in the annual credit plan, every state has its own ACP. What does the ACP do? It effectively tells the bankers that this much of money is allocated for this, and you need to use this for these particular uses. I have still not heard any state which has said, in my annual credit plan, I've put 100 crores or 200 crores for this purpose, for water and sanitation, for FSTPs. If you put that, then in the SLBC, the State Bankers Committee meeting, and at the District Bankers meeting, the system will start knowing about it. And the minute the system says, I have a target, internal target to achieve, you don't need further funding. You just establish, apart from the 15th Finance Commission and public financing mechanism to support it. Those are my key points. Thank you.
No, thank you, Manoj. I think you also brought up the point around the unique roles each stakeholder can play. I think that's very powerful. And, RK, if you maybe to start with your reflections as well on what you've heard, you saw how the poll results were, highly, indicative that people feel like there is a lot to be done on the capacity building side for the government, both in terms of the technical expertise, but also what Sujata mentioned at the beginning in terms of those softer skills as well. Your views on this as well as the larger topic, that will be helpful.
Yeah, actually, I would start from where Manoj left. Actually, he spoke about the blended finance approach, which is actually the need of the hour. As Manoj rightly said, the demand of the urban sector, WASH sector, is huge. With more and more cities getting urbanized, and more than around, I think we came to know more than 70 new cities will be adding to the list of the smart city program or other programs, which is the demand of water supply increase in a large way, which leads to a lot of infrastructure investment and operation maintenance cost. So here it plays an important that government alone cannot address this issue. So we need the private sector engagement. That's why the USAID, we came with a policy, a private sector engagement policy, where we are focusing on how to the ways and means by which we can bring more private sector player in the water and sanitation sector. So some of the models which we have adopted are working successfully. To begin with, I would say, like we have a partnership with water.org in the state of Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra, where we are creating a lot of women entrepreneurs, basically working in water and sanitation issues, the SHG groups, the federations, and water.org is linking them with the local banks to get the credit facilities. So what we have seen is that over last year, around 30 to 40,000 loans were issued, and more than 2 million USD of capital has been mobilized. So I think this kind of innovative approach is required for us to address the huge challenge. From the USAID point, also we are trying out certain new things like the DFC. We have a global development fund program where we identify 3 banks like IndusInd Bank, Vishkarma, and Caspian, where we are giving like bank guarantee to the WASH projects. So they are also identify a lot of WASH projects, and main focus is on FSM, like FSM projects and water treatment. Those kind of companies, how to upscale those companies through bank loans, and so we are working very closely with the banks and larger financial institutes to lend loan to the WASH companies. Normally they are very reluctant because one of the main reasons they are saying is most of the projects are related to the government payment, and they express the apprehensions that there is a delay in the payment, or sometimes the payment does not happen, and so they are very reluctant to take the loans. So that is one major drawback which we are seeing in issuing of the loans by the private companies. So, and some of the success models also, like the HAM model, which is adopted by the Clean Ganga program, where they have engaged a lot of private companies through the hybrid annuity model. We found it very much useful, and those kind of models has to be also promoted. So in overall, as I echo what Manoj said, that we should think out of box, like we should engage more private sector and think about innovative financing opportunities, which we are currently focusing. I hope together along with the government, we can meet the huge demand in the sector. Thank you.
Thanks, RK and Manoj. Maybe as we hear some of this, I wanted to maybe hear from Karthik and Anurag, if you are there, your views on private financing mechanism that enables this, this larger pool to be actually available. You have both experience in creating instruments that change the incentives as well as also to start moving it towards outcomes. Karthik, maybe I'll start with you if you don't mind, and Anurag, I'll come to you after that. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks. No, this is a great discussion, and I agree with most of the key points that have been raised. Principally, the criticality of this what we call tri-sector collaboration. That you need to have the government work side by side with the private sector in order to solve these challenges, because simply from an impact investment perspective, the returns are not there from an investing perspective in WASH. From an equity returns perspective, it's more like debt returns, but the impact is very much there, right? And everyone acknowledges how critical to health and human welfare WASH is. And so blended finance is clearly the solution, but how do we get to that? And several key points have already been made. Number one, there's a strong need for philanthropic and CSR capital to underwrite the inherent risk, because only when you have outcome funding at the table, then risk capital can come into the mix. Second point is, we have to keep in mind that there's multiple ways to think about blended finance, not just social and development impact bonds. Okay, and I'll come to that. Now, social impact bonds are obviously the best way because this is the public good and the government is super involved. We at ASHA are currently working on a social impact bond right now, India's first such instrument, which is in Pimpri Chinchwad, in next to Pune, and this is in healthcare. So there's buy-in from the local administrator, the municipal commissioner, to say, look, I want to do this because they have a budget of 200 crores or whatever for healthcare. So then the question becomes, what will a CIB do differently? Why should you do a social impact bond? It's not just financial engineering, that you've taken some capital from the private sector and added it on top of public capital. What can that municipal commissioner do differently with the CIB money that he can't do with his regular budget? And there's answers to that. It could be ASHA workers, it could be point of care healthcare applications, right? Not the regular CapEx-y stuff, spending on hospitals or spending on infrastructure. So you have to think like that what's the additionality, the different thing that this private capital is bringing, right? And who is underwriting it? So these foundations and all of that exist. So between the foundations and the risk capital, there needs to be this collaboration if development impact bonds, social impact bonds are going to be created. But in addition to that, it's also worth thinking about 5-6 other types of blended finance structures. Simple ones being impact-linked debt. If it's a more market-based structure where the end beneficiary can pay in some way. So we're seeing this, for example, in skilling. Skilling has been a very push-based model, but now it's possible that the person who goes through that skilling can pay for it themselves if they can be given an affordable loan, not at 21-25%, but at like a much lower interest rate. And then the outcome funding essentially guarantees that. It becomes like a risk guarantee, or even something as simple as an interest subvention. Okay, so imagine you have an NBFC or some impact investor like us lending to debt, to waste pickers, to any aspect of the value chain, affordable lending, right? And because the philanthropist subsidizes that interest cost. So the NBFC lends at market, but the philanthropist subsidizes that interest cost, and all kinds of other guarantee structures, right? So I think this is wonderful, this discussion that Dasra has put together, and the kind of participation from the different folks here around the table, because this is exactly the kind of collaboration that's needed. And we as Asha Impact, like I said, we're happy to talk about this further with anyone who's interested. Since we are doing this Pimpri Chinchwad social impact bond, we are now talking to the DMA, the government of Maharashtra, the Department of Municipal Affairs, which deals with all the smaller municipalities. And many of those guys are interested in this, saying, how do we do a development impact bond, a social impact bond in waste management, in sanitation and wash. So I think it will need all of us to come around the table, because risk capital by itself is not enough. You need a policymaker to raise their hand and say, I will do it. You need philanthropists to say, I will provide some outcome funding. And then you need people like Dasra and others to do the structuring and the intermediation amongst all of us. So it's a good time to kick off some of these collaboratives. And I know many of the inspiring people on this call, are already working on this. So thank you. Great to be here with all of you.
No, thanks, Karthik. I think you brought up a point, which is how do you make risk-taking less risky? How do you generally promote those entrepreneurial spirits, right? Anurag, I don't know if you want to build off on that or if you want to share some larger perspectives before we go into the mechanisms. Yeah.
So Arvind, at the start, you mentioned that you wanted us panelists to also, contradict each other. So let me start with that. So I actually disagree with Karthik that there isn't adequate returns to be made in this space. I'll talk about Avishkar's experience. So in Avishkar, we've made investments in clean water, access to clean water space. We've made investments in a company that's providing sanitation services, building toilets, not only building but also servicing. So I had a hybrid model. And we've made an investment where, in fact, Karthik is a co-investor in a waste management company called NEPRA, which is dealing with dry waste. And I can tell you that in all the three companies that we've actually gone in and made very early stage equity investments, we had a very, very strong investment thesis. And in fact, we were followed with follow-on capital, which actually, in the water company, our value was 10x in 2 years. In the sanitation company, not so spectacular, but still it was multiple times of our investment we've already exited. And in the waste management company, we've just during the COVID, when all our waste plants were all locked down, we were still able to sell stake from a previous fund at 7x. So firstly, these are hard facts to dispute the fact that returns cannot be made in this space. I think these are all very, very large opportunities. And if we have entrepreneurs who have good business models that make economic sense, and they execute properly, then there is a lot of return to be made as well. So that's point number one. Second, I don't disagree. I mean, there are a lot of things that do require both philanthropic as well as maybe softer funding terms. So I don't disagree with the fact. There was a point made earlier by one of the panelists. I think Meera made that point about many of these businesses happen to be government facing, and there is this big issue of receivables from the government. In fact, at Avishkar, as an equity funder, we have a very, very strong negative screen for any business which is government facing because of our experience with some past investees. And in fact, the water company, which actually was at a 10x value when a follow-on round happened, eventually came to a point of bankruptcy just because it was government facing. A lot of the contracts were with government and trying into huge receivables problems. So these are certain things that actually end up scaring risk capital away from important sectors like these. So that's another perspective. Of course, a lot of work that is happening on impact bonds, outcome-based funding, etc., are much needed, and I think can drive towards greater performance-linked incentives to capital, which I think is a good initiative. Also, anything that can improve transparency into the way the government contracts are awarded and payment mechanisms, etc., will also be very helpful.
Thanks, Anurag. I think you're bringing up a point which is basically, why would people want to work with government? What will help people start being ready to work with government? I don't know if any of the panelists want to react to any of the points so far. Otherwise, I want to actually bring some of those private entrepreneurs into this discussion, and share some views. Yeah, Meeraji, you have a point? Yeah, please go ahead. Sorry, we are not able to hear you. Maybe.
I just wanted to support the last point made by Anurag on, we have referred to that as delayed payments by local governments particularly, but by all governments, I think that is true. And we need to find some mechanisms to improve on that, because all the private operators that we have talked to, all of them said service provision is not an issue. We can certainly do that, but if payments are not done in time and properly, then it becomes an issue. And that is something that it would be very interesting to see whether there are any possible ways of addressing. One thing we suggest, we've been discussing actually, is whether there is any way to introduce more transparency in contract payments. And maybe that, if you make it in public domain, and whether that would help in terms of bringing, and whether philanthropic capital is likely to support such a move, meaning, in tendering process, there is relatively better transparency, and whether there are mechanisms to bring in terms of contract payments also. That would be a certainly interesting possibility to explore.
Just a thought. I think maybe one can draw a little bit of a parallel from the income tax department, formerly, known for all the corruption and face-to-face interaction. How the way they've made the whole process faceless. If you have a refund, you get interest on it if it's delayed. So maybe that could be an interesting thing to follow.
Absolutely. Even Provident Fund apparently has similarly done far better with greater transparency. And so the old thing that I remember is railway bookings. When we were students, it was impossible to get tickets. And now it is very easy. So those are, but that is the kind of thinking that, because that can actually change the whole scenario in terms of, especially for relatively smaller players in the market, how do they manage otherwise? And that would be good.
Meeraji, you should. What is your thought on the having audit by third-party auditors doing the audit and separating out the?
I'm asking the question. Sorry, I'm not able to see who's the participant.
Manoj.
Manoj. Okay.
So I was quick question that there's also the third-party audit. So therefore, you separate the payer from the auditor. I mean, those two things are the government audits and pays, and therefore it gets delayed. If we have a third party auditing, then a consultant does the audit and that's verified, then the paying has to happen. What's your thought on that?
That is there in large contracts, what is known as independent engineer kind of.
Correct, but take it into the small.
But that may not, it may add too many layers and costs to bring it into smaller contracts, possibly. I mean, it can be looked at, but.
Yeah. And Abha, if you can also, if you have any perspectives on this.
Loved Anurag's point on, the government facing entities are high risk. Actually, that set up all kinds of opportunities for me in terms of funding. Anurag, my experience of working with philanthropic, bilateral and other kind of donors is, if you show additionality of risk money coming in by them doing something to help the security of those government facing organizations. Now, this could be either that they allow for working capital or other forms of cash, or that allows you to take a risk on them, almost like Crystal would, putting a rating on them. They'd be very up for it. All donors like additionality. So if you can show us ways in which you can bring additionality, we can show you ways in which philanthropy will be willing to take that on. And I think at best, philanthropy is, I call it the most flexible, and it's the golden pound or the golden dollar or rupee, whatever you might call it. That golden dollar loves being leveraged now. And you are the kinds of people we look at for that leverage. So actually those conversations should open up, so we can open those conversations to you, and you in turn can give us this kind of insight, which helps us understand investor mindsets and address the issues that you might have to come into it. So real need to talk to each other on that, Anurag.
Absolutely, Abba. So I think that's already happening. We are already seeing that with both sanitation company as well as waste
Anurag, if you
management
can
company.
speak up a little bit, please. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, just speak up a little bit, please. It was a little faint. Yeah.
No, I was just saying that this is already happening. We are seeing that in all these companies where we went in very early, where the business model itself was not validated. So we took that risk with equity, and once the validation is there, we are seeing even commercial debt as well as these social impact bonds. Those conversations have already started, as well as philanthropy capital, and it is the golden pound, so it needs to be used sparingly. It doesn't necessarily need to go into places where the business is viable and sustainable on its own. So in fact, at times we've even discouraged our entrepreneurs to seek philanthropic capital where they don't need it.
And there I'm with you. I think if it's used well, it can be an unlocker. Used badly, it can be a dependency. So there's a conversation around that one too.
Yeah, in fact, that was one of those conversations. Also, at the end of the day, we need to capacitate our governments to be able to do this and not bypass the structures also. And how do you strengthen those institutions? And this is good. And please continue this conversation also. I want to maybe, some of those parties affected by this, I want to call in and, maybe Manas, as an entrepreneur, your views. And also, we need some of those mechanisms that we discussed. If you have experience on this, and Sujata, you spoke about it in the beginning about viable projects. Maybe between the three of you, I want to maybe segue into the next round. Manas, if you can go first, and then I'll call on Vineet and Abdullah, and then Sujata.
Sure thing, Arvind. Thanks very much. So I'll speak from the entrepreneur hat primarily, but I'll also touch upon my role in helping to set up an impact fund around WASH and Borda's working with cities. I think there's no getting away from the starting point that when you're in water and sanitation, you've got the multiple aspects. Right? One is the very citizen-facing thing, where you see microfinance loans, people building their toilets, water connections, etc. And then broadly, you can say you're the infrastructure part, which cannot be done by individuals or even by non-profits, where the government plays the dominant role. I think especially in that, there is no getting away from the need, and we talked about this yesterday also, for long-term planning and a holistic planning process. Because you can't do things piecemeal. You can't build today, dig tomorrow, build day after. You can't do this, water today, toilets yesterday, then FSM someday, and then solid waste some other day. You need to sort of have a holistic process that takes the entire city, and I would say its neighboring areas as cities grow, and we eat into peri-urban areas or sort of destroy them for our quality of living. So there is no getting away from that planning, and will help private players, government, financiers, investors, all to get aligned in a certain way on what to do, how to do it. Along with this goes, as RK said, a hybrid annuity model or long-term public-private partnerships. See, today, most government contracts are still 2-year, 3-year contracts, right? As a private player, you cannot get into a situation, build capability, understand what to do, perform well, earn a return, and get out in 2-3 years. So either your contracts are poorly designed or they get poorly executed because nobody really knows what's actually going on, or they get captured by local players who know how to game the system and will earn the money without delivering the results. And when you have a long-term plan, you can also get multiple parties on board, different government departments, right? And see. So we did this work over the last 2 years. We helped the government in Ladakh to develop a Leh Vision 2030. And for many international experts who we got involved in this process said that this has been one of the most inclusive we had a lot of ward level conversations, events, sector level conversations, etc. Now, yesterday we got a call. The police department sent a certain proposal on how they wanted to change the traffic rules because now summer is coming for tourism and all they're preparing. The government sent back a note saying, how does this align with Leh Vision 2030? And the police then contacted us because we were helping to put it. We didn't do the Leh Vision. We helped them to put it together. They reached out to our local partner in there saying, can you give us a debrief on what the vision is all about? So we can make sure that our traffic planning ideas are aligned with Vision 2030, right? So this is one, how long it will sustain, how much they will do, I can't say right now, but at least it's an example of how a vision and a plan get people aligned. And so if you start aligning water, sanitation, waste management, housing, maybe even things like agriculture or public spaces from a reuse perspective of wastewater reuse, when you start pulling all these together and stop looking at things, this thing, it helps the private players as well. The second thing is, I'll just point on metrics and measurement, right? We have all these different, now indexes, as Miraji mentioned. But if you look at, what are they really measuring? Are they measuring outcomes? Are they measuring outputs? Are we taking the easy way? If you look at sustainable development goals, right? Very good framework for the most part. But if you look at the SDGs, the way India has adopted them and the targets we have set, if you look at SDG 6, there is nothing about water body protection, water, wastewater management. None of that comes into SDG 6.1. So as long as you take water, deplete the groundwater, pollute your water bodies, you can hit SDG 6.1. You can hit SDG 6. SDG 11 doesn't talk about STP capacity. It doesn't talk about whether you're treating all your wastewater or not. So if I build capacity equal to the theoretical wastewater generated in a city, I hit my SDG 11, but all my sewage could still be going into water body because the pipes are not there connected to the STPs, right? So we need to also take a very genuine look at, what are we measuring? And then are we rewarding the government, or in some way, are we penalizing people for not meeting the right targets? Today, a lot of your transfer rules, your promotion rules are completely irrelevant or disconnected from that. So that would be, and now these things then lead to the finance part. And I think when coming to the entrepreneur hat, see, funding is difficult. And I think getting funding for an entrepreneur should be difficult. I mean, you should have to sweat for money. If money comes in too easy, today we see at the startup level, easy money, easy seed capital, easy awards, you sort of lift a finger and people give you awards and praise you. I don't think honestly that is good for entrepreneurship. But investors also need to get aligned. And I think a lot of the blending of capital is better done at an investor level than at the enterprise level. Because at some level, investors have the ability to look at the bigger picture in certain ways that most entrepreneurs do not have the ability to understand different kinds of capital and the nuances and different players, short-term, long-term, what will help their business. So I think you need, trusted investors who can bring in that blend of capital, who can align with the entrepreneur, who can also align with other investors. And because, you see a lot of differences between different investors and their priorities and their metrics and so on. And that just adds a lot of workload to the entrepreneur, where a lot of social entrepreneurs are not, they're not equipped to handle that level of complexity and conversation, right? So I would kind of leave it at that and say that.
Thank you, Manas. In fact, I think, the same thing around entrepreneurs. And I want to link it back to the point that we started off when Miraji mentioned the whole role of SMEs as well as self-help groups as well. And Vineet, I know you have done a lot of work in this aspect, right? Like, is there a level playing field? Can we use this mechanism to also make that part more equitable? If you can chip in a little bit on that. And then, Apula, I'll come to you after that, and Sujata after that to you as well.
Thanks, Arvind. Hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
I'll come to the SME part, but I also wanted to touch on few elements here and there where the experts initially hinting at. When I look at the entire WASH ecosystem, and I'm also hereby linking to what Ava said, we need to first understand where the problem lies, right? So if we divide the entire thing into a supply side problem and a demand side problem. By supply side, what I mean is the government, the ULBs, etc. And by demand side, I mean the individuals, the SMEs. For now, the demand side would be SMEs. If we try to divide these two key stakeholders, at the supply side, the government side, you definitely need interventions like capacity building. You need people to probably you need to teach people how to structure a project. The biggest problem when we spoke to many SMEs was that they were not sure whether this was the ideal structure of the project to be implemented. Whether these projects can be linked to some real estate projects, where these projects can be structured with any other offering. So effective structuring, contract management, these all come under the capacity building perspective. And I feel that definitely there is a need for capacity building to improve the supply side. Now, within staying still on the supply side, I forgot who was talking about it, but can we incentivize these ULBs to make payments at the right time? Is something we can think about. I mean, Just taking an example from BAT, BAT last year, towards the end of last year, launched SIIB, Skill India Impact Bond, which was basically incentivizing NSDC on achieving outcomes. NSDC was making payments to all these service providers. If the service providers achieve outcomes, NSDC would get an additional money from the outcome funders. That was the model. Now, can we look at some similar model involving 5 to 6 larger ULBs, where there is an outcome funder who says one of the outcomes you need to take is timely payments, and then we make you the payment. So maybe they are encouraged to pay at the right time, and also they have some additional money to deploy. So that's one. Maybe it's a wild thinking. Maybe I'm not too sure about the practicality of it, but that is one innovative mechanism which we can think at the supply side. Then when I go to the demand side, where the biggest one would be the SME. When we discuss with a lot of these SMEs, the biggest challenge again coming in from the supply side is that because of delay in payments, there is a lot of stress on the working capital. Now, can we have a outcome-based mechanism in which the burden of loan on the SME is lowered? Currently, most of these SMEs, you can call them as only what you call small enterprises, not even medium. I don't see a lot of medium enterprises as well. Very, very few medium enterprises. But these small enterprises have largely enterprises largely go to the NBFCs for funding. Now, these NBFCs charge anything above 18 to 20%. This becomes a huge burden. Now, whether through some innovative models we can prove to the world that, look, a PSU bank rate is viable for such enterprises. How do we do that? Maybe an innovative mechanism in which there is an NBFC involved, there is an interest subvention coming in, and we prove that 12% interest rate works for small enterprises in the WASH segment. In this way, probably we can create pilots, we can show to the world that, look, such systems work, and maybe get in more partners and scale it up. Happy to take any questions, but that's what I majorly wanted to cover.
Yeah, thank you, Vineet. Pula, if you want to go next, again, any larger perspectives before, also some of these questions around capacity building of the government as well as private players, what does that mean? Your experiences around that.
Yeah. So I think there's a larger consensus anyway that any improvement in service delivery, especially when it comes to WASH as well, requires a systemic overhaul in the way we govern our cities, the way the capacities are currently there, and the quality of urban governance in our cities needs to be changed completely. And we believe there are a set of catalytic reforms, especially focusing on improving the municipal finances, the staffing capacities, and even citizen engagement, which there was some conversation on the chat box as well, how they can play a potential role in creating an irreversible cycle of municipal strengthening. So I'll talk about each of these elements briefly. First is on the financial sustainability of a ULB. So while there is a role for private players and entrepreneurs, philanthropies to bring in private funding, I think there's nothing that can replace public money. And the ROI on that as well is quite high. So how we need to ensure that a ULB, to ensure long-term sustainability of any service, the financial sustainability of the ULB is extremely critical. And there are three preconditions to that. One is that we need to rationalize fiscal decentralization. So more revenue streams need to go down to ULBs. They need to have greater power to set up, say, their own property tax rates or determine when they want to revise that tax rate. Now, the Central Finance Commission, the government listens to them. Their recommendations are very well accepted. But what about the State Finance Commissions? That institution currently is extremely weak, and for them to play a greater role in devolving more powers to the ULBs and also recognizing, say, running state level schemes or grants that are more predictable, the fiscal transfers that are more predictable that go down to the ULB level. An important thing here also is optimizing the ULB's own sources of revenue. So, and there is need for reform along the entire value chain. We see starting from enumeration to valuation, even collections and simple things like billing and reporting of the collection data. That's really messed up across all ULBs. We did an assessment actually of cost recovery for water and sanitation in Odisha and found that only 20 to 30% of the O&M cost is actually recovered via own revenue sources. So, I mean, state cannot continue funding O&M forever. So any long-term sustainability of the sector requires that we optimize user charges. And we're hopeful that the push for property tax and user charge reforms from 15th FC under SDM and JJM will nudge states in the right direction. Once you have the money in place, there's need to implement a fiscal responsibility and budget management framework, which ensures that the budget estimates are real, the audited account statements are out there, there's a performance reporting system in place. Second important reform area, like I said, is the staffing or institutional capacity. On an average, 35% staffing vacancies are there. Over 50% of the cities don't even have money to pay salaries for their staff. So this is where governments require support in facilitating deployment of adequate number of skilled staff, creating a learning ecosystem for them, and implementing integrated performance monitoring systems. An intervention that we're working closely with the ministry and also Odisha government is that on a municipal shared service center, which is something that will really support the long tail of municipalities to improve their skills, competencies. And why we talk about this shared service center for this long tail is we did an assessment where we found that around 80% of India's urban population resides within a 60-kilometer radius of a 1 lakh plus population city. So you can, that sort of a clustering environment creates sort of a conducive setup for a shared service center, which can really help smaller ULBs tap into vendor payments, property tax collections. Last point I will make is on the citizen participation aspect. And I think its importance for inclusive access to WASH services cannot be stressed enough. While the municipal finance and staffing interventions will fix the supply side challenges on the government side, the demand, the citizen participation element is, I think, the feedback loop that completes the demand side. And citizen participation in budgets or civic works will create a platform for citizens to identify what are their priorities for their neighborhood, for their city. They can get involved in implementing those projects and also monitoring performance so that what they require actually delivers on the ground in terms of improved service.
Thank you, Apula, for bringing back the voice of citizens and the people that we're trying to solve this for. Sujata, any comments from you on, also what we've heard overall? There are a lot of questions that maybe, you can probably look at both in terms of, consumer payments as well as, different mechanisms, clustering approaches. Sujata, sorry, you're on mute. You'll have to unmute yourself.
First, I'd like to respond to what Manoj said and what there was a discussion also Vineet said about SME, the small businesses which provide services, the small contractors, etc., which face payment challenges. I have read this paper done by CWAS, Mira's team. One idea which comes is in exports, you have factoring services. Moment you export, when you have that bill, bank will discount it and give you the money. And then that loop is completed and the bank for a charge. Here in the case of municipalities, the main banker to the municipality, to the ULB, actually, if you look at ULB, they're very cash-rich organizations. There are a lot of inflows and outflows. Accounting quality is poor, but cash is there. So if the banker to the ULB can take those bills of a SME enterprise, give them say 80 or 90%, whatever the appropriate number is. Bill is presented, this money is released, and 20% you decide based on that actually with how much your work has been completed, if there are any disputes. So you leave a small scope for disputes, and the rest is cleared. Then this point which Manoj others about third-party audit or lenders engineer with the project, saying that there's a third-party approved certification based on which the bank can release an X percentage of money to the entrepreneur or the small business, and the rest goes through the process. Typically, I think the way the municipal system works is there are incentives and disincentives for processing bills. So if there's there's patronage at some level, those bills get processed, the others don't get processed. So the cost of the working capital, getting the payments is very, very high for the local entrepreneur. I mean, they will find ways to beat the system, but you have to start moving towards it. So what are the incentives for timely release of payments? I mean, there have to be financial incentives for the ULB, but also incentives for staff, which compensates for these other, I don't want to mention words, but other factors at play which influence which bill gets processed and which doesn't get processed. We have to recognize these realities. Otherwise, we will keep topping, nothing will happen. The second point, I also agree with Apula's point about, shared services. I think there's a huge scope in that. Can you create, a cluster of, resource pool, which works across different municipalities and not just, is assigned to one municipal corporation. That may be economical for states. Let's see how it pans out in Orissa, that you cluster them 8, one large ULB with 8 and smaller ULBs or whatever the appropriate number is, and you provide a skilled manpower pool to that group. And that does not work in one municipality, but is responsible for the entire.
Yeah.
I mean, as an idea, it sounds very exciting, but let's see how it gets implemented and what the feedback on the ground is. That's it from my side. I'm open to any other questions.
No, thank you. In fact, maybe I'll request a short poll. Having heard so many folks given different recommendations, we've tried to cluster some of those recommendations and we can launch it. Thank you. Is that all the responses, team? Just let me know if the poll is over. Looks like there's a fair split in terms of the number of problems to solve for or the solutions that we can go behind. Maybe with this, Dineshji, I want to see if you had a point of view and after hearing all of this, and then I can summarize a little bit with some of the takeaways, and then after that I want to bring the panel back together to say what the point Abba you brought up, right? The role of philanthropy. So maybe Dineshji, if I can ask you to share your views on this, also seeing the audience's choice of.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And first of all, thanks to Dasra for organizing this very interesting panel. And some of us who have been working with governments all my life, and as Chetan Vaidya, one of our discussants, said that most of our time, right from my days in NIUA with ministry and then with UN, government of governments, etc. But I think every panel discussion has brought out some key important issues, and I can still see on the poll that there's a mixed opinion about. I want to bring back the attention to the topic of the discussion. We're talking about innovative financing for WASH, and that is inclusive for inclusive cities. Now, in the beginning, all our panelists talked about, and I think it was Meera who started off saying money is not an issue. And I think money may not be an issue, but there is an issue in reaching that infrastructure to the people who need it. What I call the last mile connectivity. And city after city, we've seen water projects, sanitation projects, sewer lines being laid, and the large number of slum areas, large number of vulnerable population all left out. How do we bring them onto the service level? Even with Swachh Bharat, we have seen in many states that many slum dwellers are not really a part of this, simply because city authority says, oh, there is no network, we can't put our desludging truck. So I think we need to think how we can address the problems of the what I call the last mile connectivity. And this is where I think the whole philanthropy capital, the whole innovative financing, etc., is important. How do we bring? I mean, I hear panelists Abha and Karthik and Anurag and all talking about result-based funding or outcome-based funding, blended finance. No matter what form of financing we bring in, I think the target is one of your important metric has to be that the poor in the city are served. And I think that's the key aspect to it. The second aspect is that, in my opinion, and as everybody said, I think Meera started that local government don't pay enough, and everybody says that people are averse to working with government. But we recognize that WASH is a public good, that there are, if you look at the whole sanitation chain, there is a private realm where we talk about toilets and we can talk about the containment system. Now that is well funded by people themselves, household themselves, and agencies like water.org and others have done excellent work in managing that. When it gets outside the private realm into the public realm, we have to deal with the local government. And all these issues that are being raised about local governments need to be addressed to make them strong, to make them able to service. But I think we also need to ensure that the government funds actually, in my opinion, are not enough. What Meera started to say is that where can the additional capital bring in to add value, the way she was talking about. So in cities of Sinnar, why we know that there is philanthropy capital to put up a treatment facility, or in Sinnar where the city put its own facility, but we bring in innovative capital or innovative mechanism like what we call PLAM. I think some of our team members have put it on the chat box. The performance linked annuity payment. So a private desludger is contracted, but users don't pay, but the city uses a tax mechanism to enable payment. So you can avoid a lot of these issues, but we can bring around some of these issues. So I think these are the ways in which we will need to ensure that our inclusive services, that the poor in our cities are served. And I'm going to stop here, but my final plea is to the philanthropists and the CSR. And I was reading the Dasra philanthropy report that was released on day 1 of your philanthropy week. And I saw that 50% of the philanthropy capital in this country is going for health, education, others. And although in your own report you identified sanitation and others, and I think we all urge that that is a sector that has a larger payoff. And we are teaching a course currently to IHE students in Delft in Netherlands online on WASH financing. And we are saying that there is a 1:7 payout, that $1 invested in sanitation has a $7 outcome effect. So there is a larger economic value, and the reverse, that if you poor sanitation actually loses out, India lost out 6% of GDP, etc. I think these numbers have to be hammered again and again to make sure that WASH is an important sector. And finally, on the geography, with 33% of the funds are going into Maharashtra, a state that we are working, we would certainly like to tap them. We haven't seen much of that money, where it is going, but also other geographies in the country are, I think, equally important. So I would just stop here.
No, thank you, Dinesh. I think, just if I could share my screen on what all we heard from, each of the participants, and I think you nailed it in terms of explaining the big call to action, right? I think the role of philanthropy. It's the oil, it's not the fuel. I think mistaking that is a big mistake that people can make. And like you said, there is a big payoff there. There is a leverage multiplier, which is, much, much higher if we are able to focus on, the right entry points, right? And starting with a few things that we heard. One is, how do we add value to the public investments that are already made? In Bharat's term, it was budgets to projects. You said, finally, the services need to reach the last mile. but there are various ways in which we can make this happen. And secondly, I think, how do we demystify data but move away from ranking towards decision making? How do we use all of these approaches to actually enable the right allocation of resources? And Abba, you brought up this point, right? Like if you know where the actual intervention can be made, then creating those instruments that specifically target that problem statement might be easier. And thirdly, the role of the private sector and how do we promote entrepreneurship? If we can do a few things simply, and if you can enable a few things, there are different ways in which we can do it. It might be a small tweak in the contract. It might be a better way of bridge financing. It might be, some more capacity building to the governments to be able to pay on time. And maybe it's an offshored, services like Apula was saying. And, the fourth thing was around the training itself. And if we were to rethink training, not as capacity building as an end in itself, but to say, can we use this to scale these solutions faster? I think, one of the participants only said it, saying we need to reduce the cost of experimentation. And I think it was Bharat, you said this, right? Like, how do we improve standardization? And this can really help us do diffusion at a much faster pace than we can do if we were to go city by city and state by state. And finally, the most important point that we heard was the mindset shift. And, money can change a lot of minds. So how do we use money in a smart way that we do these nudges? And where are the nudges required? And if we can identify that, and if we can make risk-taking as a lesser risky proposition for those who are willing to bet their time and life behind it, then that will be a great way for philanthropy to come into play a role. And, with this, I want to actually call the panel back together and say, like Dineshji mentioned, if there was a single call to action that you will give to funders, right? If there were things that you would rather say, if there is 20x in front of us to be able to enable that citizens get inclusive services in the next 10 years, can we improve the lives of citizens? What would that call to action to philanthropy be? At the end of the day, I don't want the funders in the room to think there is a lot of money, so we don't have a job. But how do we specifically say we can draw in people accordingly? And I don't need to, I don't have a sequence in mind in case, Sujata, if I see you are not on mute, so maybe if you want to start and then I can go.
You at a very fundamental, sorry, am I audible? Okay. I think at a very fundamental level, I think, how do you reach out to citizens in terms of services? You have projects geared for delivering services. So some level sort of model which Janagra did in Bangalore or something, where maybe philanthropy can ensure that planning for projects is done inclusively, the NGOs, civil society participation. And, there's like somebody talked about Vision 2030 for Leh. If something like that be prepared, which is transparent, which is inclusive, which has citizen participation, and that is a base document, and you can get the city to buy into, city government to buy into that. There may be deviations, driven by central funding, state funding, but a basic plan will be there, that these are priorities of the city. If you're not addressed immediately, they will get addressed over time. I think that awareness of what is needed, what do citizens want, and what is needed is very important. Currently, I don't think that awareness exists. It's completely driven either by what higher levels of government want or what individuals, be it the mayor or the commissioner, want. It is not driven by citizens or ground level understanding of what is working, what is not
working. Abba, Bharat, Meeraji, if any of you want to go next.
Firstly, thank you. This was brilliant. Lots of great discussions. I'll name check hundreds of people, starting from Meera, Anurag, Karthik, Manas, Vineet, all brilliant points. I don't want to repeat any of those. But I do want to say I just want to say one thing. Tools are tools, problems are first. And I will repeat that like politicians repeat that on the radio here. Think tool later, think problem first. Listen to the people who know the problem best. Listen to all your stakeholders, your end users, your non-profits, your governments, and then design with thought and care. And finally, something which really COVID forced me to do is stop putting people in siloed boxes. Stop thinking as government as the outcome buyer, the risk investors as private sector, service delivery organizations as doing end mile. Everything can be done differently. Government can take risk, investors can have patience, and end users can be part of design. And if you're bold enough to do that, funding comes. Funding is never the issue. You have to design well, and you've got to listen to the likes of Meera while you're doing that, or you end up selling bad stuff, and philanthropy then makes mistakes. So that's my only plea to that. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Bharat.
Sure, thanks, Arvind. And I echo Abha in sort of thanking you for organizing such a rich and wonderful discussion. I thought this was just an extraordinary discussion. So thanks a ton for it. In terms of the call to action for philanthropy, what I would say is that, I think sort of starting with something as basic as recognizing that, when we look at livelihoods and when we look at the engines for India's growth, really a large part of it is going to come from cities. I think there is some acknowledgement of that, but probably not enough. And I think therefore saying, what is it that we can do to fix the condition of our cities is something that I see as a very fundamental issue for, looking at what India needs to do on its development trajectory over the next 10, 20 years. So I think starting from something as basic as that and then saying there's a lot of need for innovation on a number of different areas. Right? I mean, many of those have been talked about in this discussion. I won't repeat all of them, but to pick some of the basic ones, even on things like procurement processes or payment processes, there's a need for innovation on many of those areas. And that is really where I think philanthropy can focus, because I think once those innovations are sort of figured out, then I think allowing government to help scale those up, I think is a path that has worked in many other sectors as well. And hopefully in the urban sector as well, that's the path that can be followed. And I think that there are a lot of really innovative organizations out there that are trying interesting things, a lot of innovative approaches being piloted in a number of different areas. So I think if there were a bit more focus on it from the part of philanthropy, to say, hey, how can we support many of these innovations and bring them to a point where government can then adopt? I really think it can do wonders for the urban ecosystem in general.
No, thank you, Bharat. And you're already a champion, so you should help us bring more champions into this cause. With that, Meeraji, over to you.
Yeah, I'm good. I think everybody has said, and I don't want to repeat. I mean, obviously, many of the points are very critical and important. I want to say something totally different in a way. When I take my class on urban finance and fiscal, I talk about the fact that Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation had, who as mayor, before this is, I think, pre-independence, Sardar Patel. My point I'm trying to make is the people of that stature were actually leading our cities at that time. And we have obviously gone wrong somewhere. I don't think that cities have that kind of leaders anymore. And I think we need to do things, and there are many things that were talked of, that will help bring back politicians of that stature to cities, to our leading cities. And that, I think, is critical. Without that, the voice of the urban sector in terms of all the issues that we talked about may not really materialize. So that, to my mind, is very, very important. And I'm going to end with one very practical thing also, since nobody talked about. This is, of course, more what my vision would be. But a practical thing, we were struggling, and NFSSM Alliance actually put up some recommendations to the 15 Finance Commission. And there are several that I think Janagra also did, we also did, and many things have been accepted. But one thing that was accepted and has not been discussed much is a provision that they have linked some of their funding to the fact that whether state governments will put up their state finance commissions. We talked of transfers to local governments. Majority of transfers to local governments don't come from national government, they come from state governments. And state finance commissions, which were one of the main provisions in the 74th Amendment Act, has not been fulfilled by most states, barring a few ones like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and I think to some extent Karnataka. But everywhere else, either they are not formed, if they are formed, their reports are not taken into account, nobody has access to the kind of data, kind of resources that are necessary. So, I mean, I know it's a very different take I'm asking philanthropy to look at. We are, of course, working on all these impact bond and this, that, but I think this is something that to help materialize or help to concretize this provision of 15 Finance Commission, to make sure that state finance commissions are set up, they are properly endowed with the kind of funding that is necessary, it will dramatically change the local government funding scenario and therefore its status and therefore the kind of politicians that get attracted. I think other things, everybody knows all these. I think if Chetan is there, still Chetan will say all of this has been talked of for last 30, 40 years. We are not really saying anything very, very new. But some of these completely new. How do we bring out politicians of Sardar Patel's stature? And a very minor issue, I'm saying, philanthropy guys will never think of this because there is no direct impact. But I urge, I don't know everybody's names, Anurag and Abha and Bharat and everybody to think about this, that this is completely different use of philanthropy and it will go a long way in making local governments the way we were talking about. That's it.
Thank you, Meeraji. In fact, I think looking at city level leadership, how do we get those local level actors together and enabling them to actually take these decisions and empowering? That's fantastic. Thank you. In fact, maybe if I can request and Mr. Chetan, sorry I couldn't bring you back. I saw you nodding to Meeraji's comments, and I'm hoping that you enjoyed this discussion as well. But if I can have the Dasra team pull up the poll, we want to continue this conversation. I saw a lot of interest in some of these specific aspects that came up. If you can respond to how would you like to continue your journey in this, right? And as Dasra, we can try to.
Are we not allowed to participate? Exclusion by polling, is it? So
sorry, that's a Zoom restriction because you're a co-host. So it's allow the host to participate.
Excluded, so we aren't allowed to have a voice.
Yeah. I was also struggling to find how do I give, and then I realized, okay, we can't do.
Meeraji, we are not, we don't poll. We are being polled, I think. The other way.
Sorry, if I can have the results up a little bit, Dasra team, please. Yeah, thank you. Is the poll over? Okay. Okay, with that, maybe then we are almost at the end of the session. Thank you first of all for all of those who have said you would like to continue the journey, and one of my biggest indicators is how many people are still remaining at the end of the conversation, and I'm happy to see so many people still hooked on to this. We have a great session coming up next, and Abha, to your point around philanthropy, we have a session tomorrow on pay what it takes philanthropy, but at 5:30 we are also talking about climate change and adolescence and some of those. For those who are interested in these topics, please stay tuned to some of these sessions as well. And we will find the current session also being recorded and put on the public domain in our DPW microsite as well as on YouTube. And you can forward this to people who might be interested to learn more. With that, we can have the final poll on how was your experience in this session, and we'll take your feedback and hopefully use it for our upcoming sessions. Dasra team, please, if you can put up the final poll. And thanks everyone. If after the poll, you can probably log off. Thanks.
Thank you, Arvind.